At the beginning of this series, we looked at the Epicurean trilemma, and we took that as our starting point, as our launch pad, if you will, for this series. Remember, the Epicurean trilemma says, is God willing to prevent evil, but just not able to? Then he is not all-powerful. Is he able to prevent evil, but just not willing to? Then he is not good. Is God both willing and able to prevent evil? Then why does evil exist in the world? As I mentioned at the beginning of this series, this trilemma encapsulates the main thrust of the argument against God for so many people. So many people will say that if God exists, then why is there evil, pain and suffering in the world? In fact, if there's evil, pain and suffering in the world, then God can't possibly exist. This is the number one objection to Christianity. But I hope we can now see that this thought process, this trilemma, is actually severely flawed. Throughout this series, we've seen that there are several perfectly legitimate reasons why a powerful and good God would let the world keep spinning with pain and suffering in it. And as we wrap up this series now, let's briefly summarize what those reasons are. In the first episode, we learned why evil exists at all, and why it's not God's fault that it exists in our world. You see, God created this world to be perfect, but he also made human beings with free will to choose. And unfortunately, the first human beings chose to know evil. They chose to let it into the world, believing that this knowledge would make them as gods. From that moment, evil began to corrupt and overwhelm their hearts and the world around them, and from then on, pain, suffering, and death became inevitable in this world. The Christian understanding of pain fundamentally begins with the knowledge that this world is not the one that God originally intended for us. It is a corrupted place that now only retains mere echoes of its original intended goodness. In episode 2, we saw that a lot of the misery that we experience with pain actually doesn't stem from the pain itself, which often isn't really that bad, but rather our misery stems from our attitude to that pain. If we would just listen to what God is saying about this life and adjust our attitude accordingly, then some of the pain wouldn't hit nearly as hard, we wouldn't get nearly as miserable with it, our faith wouldn't get shipwrecked by it, and we would find in general a lot more happiness in this life. That was episode 2. Having established how evil came into the world through the fall, we then started asking why a good God might let it continue existing now that evil had indeed entered in. Surely a good God would just obliterate this whole universe immediately, rather than let it roll on in this corrupted state with such things as disease, natural disasters, and death in it. But then we considered that if he had obliterated it right away, we would never have had the chance to live. We wouldn't be here, and we would have missed out on all of this good stuff. Indeed, if we're honest, the truth is that in spite of all of its problems, most of us are glad to have had this chance to live in this world, and therefore we're already kind of agreeing with God that he was right to keep the world spinning, again, even with all of its flaws. If we are glad to have had this chance to live, then we're actually hypocritical if we question God's decision to keep the world rolling, because we already agree with him that he was right to do so. We agree with him that there was enough here worth saving and worth persisting with. If most of us are enjoying life in spite of its flaws and are glad to have had this chance to live, that means there must be a lot of good in this world as well. And the good needs as much explaining as the pain does. Indeed, in this episode, we saw that this world is actually excessively good, and it's beautiful far above what function strictly requires it to be. This is why, in spite of all of its problems, most people throughout history have always attributed this world to the work of a good God rather than an evil one. There's just so much good and beauty here. And again, this needs explaining. If you're going to try to blame God for what's wrong in the world, it's hypocritical if you don't then also praise him for what's good in the world. If you're going to raise your fist in anger for the pain, you have to then raise your hands in praise for the beauty and the joy and the happiness and the fun. You can say there's undeserved tribulation here, but then there's also undeserved blessing here, which needs explaining too. There's a flip side to this discussion of pain, which often gets forgotten about. In this episode, we admitted that actually we quite like a bit of pain and trial in this life, as strange as that may seem. Struggle makes life more interesting for us. It forms the basis of all of our favourite stories and adventures and books and movies. And indeed, if we don't have anything to struggle with in life, we tend to actively go searching for some. It's like there's a void there that we need to fill somehow. We saw that a life without struggle may actually even become boring for us, using a Twilight Zone episode. In fact, I caught the end of The Hobbit on TV TV recently. And is there not a sense of melancholy and perhaps even boredom at the end of that movie when Bilbo returns home to the Shire and he knows that the dangerous, life-threatening adventures full of struggle and trials and pain are all over for him? I think there's a bit of boredom and melancholy there, and I think it's a bit like that. I think Bilbo would quite like to have gone back and relived all of those adventures and stories. And that's like us too. We enjoy the harder parts of life at times too. They form the stories of our lives, and we kind of miss them when they're gone. In episode 6 we talked about how unless you have the darkness, you don't see the stars. And similarly, without hardship, we wouldn't see such things as courage, charity, forgiveness, or self-sacrifice. Many of the best character traits that so inspire us and which we so admire. These things can only exist in a world of difficulty and hardship. Therefore, we considered the possibility that God may be allowing darkness to prevail for a while on this earth so that in the middle of it, his righteous heroes may be revealed. Who is distinguishing themselves in the middle of these dark times? God is watching. In episode 7 we saw that in the same way that a jagged rock becomes a smooth pebble by being passed through tumultuous waters, in the same way that muscles are made stronger by resistance training, and in the same way that gold is purified by fire, our character is refined and made stronger and made beautiful by struggle too. Therefore, God may be allowing us to experience some hardship so that we are refined and made stronger and beautified for the world to come. And indeed, it's interesting that in the Bible, God always places a wilderness before a promised land. The wilderness prepares the character of the people for the glory ahead. The flip side to struggle refining our character is that lack of struggle spoils our character. Endless ease and comfort actually spoils us. People who have had no hardship and discipline in life often end up weak, flabby, entitled, and miserable. Therefore, even though it's painful, good parents discipline their children and allow them to struggle occasionally so that their character is built up and so that they develop into the right kind of adults. Since God is a good father to us, we would expect him to do no less. We would expect him to discipline us. Next, we considered that God may allow pain in this world basically so that humans can learn the hard way. We often think that we are better off without God, and so many people want nothing to do with him. So this is God's way of saying, okay, I will let you experience the consequences of your own rebellious actions. I will let you see where that leads. And when at last you have created a hell on earth through your own sinful and godless behavior, perhaps then you will finally realize, you will finally come back to me and understand why I gave you my laws. The ultimate sadness, the ultimate grief that we will endure in this life is death. It's something that touches us all and that can even render life futile. However, in this episode we saw that through Jesus, death itself is now completely redefined. Through Jesus, the tragedy of death now gives way to hope. Futility gives way to meaning, and death itself gives way to eternal life. This means that through Jesus, there is comfort and there's even joy to be found in even our darkest moments. God has not left us without hope. In this episode, we discovered that many of the events that we consider to be pains in the short term are actually to our advantage in the long term. It's like when a dog goes to the vet. He thinks it's painful and he doesn't understand why it's happening, but actually it's for his own benefit that he goes to the vet. Similarly, there are things that God may let us experience that seem like problems to us at the time, but are actually to our long-term advantage as well. We looked at stories of people who were meant to be working in the Twin Towers on 9/11 in this episode, but due to problems and inconveniences they weren't there, which meant that they ultimately survived the attack. What other inconveniences could God have allowed to happen in our life that ultimately saved us? The truth is that until we get to heaven, we'll just never know how many times problems were actually blessings in disguise. The point of this episode is that we can't judge God's decisions because we don't know what he knows. Just because we don't understand the reason for pain, it doesn't mean that there isn't one. Atheists often talk about the Epicurean trilemma as though it's a huge insurmountable obstacle to Christians and that pain is a subject that we have to shirk because it simply has no answer. In this episode, however, we saw that that is simply not the case. We saw that God has in fact prioritized this subject in both the first and the oldest books of the Bible. Indeed, God was raising this issue of pain with humans long before humans thought to raise the issue themselves. The book of Job was wrestling with this issue thousands of years before Epicurus was even born. The conclusion of this episode was largely the same as the one before. If you have a God great and transcendent enough to be mad at because he hasn't stopped evil and suffering in the world, then you have at that same moment a God great and transcendent enough to have good reasons for allowing it to continue that you can't know. Indeed, you can't have it both ways. Why does a good God allow suffering to continue to exist in the world? The truth is, he could ask us the same question. The fact is that the vast majority of pain in this world actually comes directly from us, from human beings, either man's inhumanity to man, or people simply bringing disaster upon themselves through poor decision making and a love of sin. It is therefore unreasonable to blame God for things that we have caused ourselves. Hunger, poverty, broken homes, adulteries, we could stop those pains if we wanted to. We could stop them. We just choose not to because we love sin and we love our selfishness more. Now, of course, God could take our free will away from us so that we can't do those evil things. But then we realized that if he did so, he would devalue us and the world around us would be rendered meaningless. Nothing more than a simulation where nothing really means anything at all. God has decided it is better that we have free will with all of the risk that that entails. And if we really thought about it, I think that we would agree with him. The fact that we are in violent reaction to the pains and sufferings of this world, the very fact that we feel uncomfortable with any of these things, reveals an innate knowledge of something better, something that we are falling short of. Now, to the Christian, this makes perfect sense. We are falling short of Eden, the place that God originally intended for us. But for the atheist, if we merely evolved through Darwinian means, there's simply no intellectual basis to feel uncomfortable with anything that happens here, including the pain and the suffering and the struggle, especially since the evolutionary worldview literally depends on all of these things, the strong overpowering and killing the weak in a race for survival. The fact that we have a problem with struggle at all in this world is evidence for God and the Christian worldview. Sometimes God allows pain to exist so that he might personally intervene in the situation and reveal himself in a miraculous way. In the same way that darkness reveals stars and hardship reveals heroes, God can reveal himself through difficult situations. And when he does so, faith is undoubtedly strengthened and eternities altered. Like in the situation of my younger brother, who was miraculously healed in the face of all odds. It's unfortunately true that we tend to turn to God more when things are going wrong in life. When life is going well, we tend to feel quite self-sufficient and we forget about him. And this is a problem for us because life is passing and it's going to end one day. And if God needs to get our attention to remind us of our mortality and to provoke us into a relationship with him before it's too late, it's possible that he could allow some struggle for that purpose. If pain is what causes us to turn to him, then it makes sense that he might allow some in our life. Finally, we considered that whatever pain we experience on this earth, it's vital to remember that God never asks us to endure something that he hasn't personally gone through himself first. Jesus Christ, that is God in human flesh, suffered the most excruciating agonies known to man, mental, emotional, and physical. That not only makes him a God worth trusting in the middle of pain, but it puts him in a unique position to empathize with us. No other God can do so because no other God has suffered like we do on this earth. Only Jesus Christ can feel what we feel. Only he can share in our suffering, and only he can give us hope that in the end all will be well. We can also have faith that if he was willing to put himself through all of that pain to a good end, there is a good end to our pain as well. We can trust him and have faith in him because he has gone ahead of us in all of these things. If we put all of this accumulated evidence together, I think we can clearly see the flaws in the Epicurean trilemma and in that logic. It's simply not true that pain disproves the existence of God by any means whatsoever. There are many legitimate reasons why a good and all-powerful God would allow pain and suffering to exist in his world, at least temporarily. Because what we always have to remember is that this world is not the end goal here. This world is just a wilderness that we are passing through en route to a promised land up ahead, and that it's only through Jesus that we can reach that promised land. To reject God because there's pain in this world is intellectually flawed and would just be a big, big mistake. Remember the words given to the Hebrews when they were suffering in Rome. These are the words that I'm going to end this video with. It says, "Let us hold tightly without wavering to the hope that we affirm, for God can be trusted to keep his promise." Think back on those early days when you first learned about Christ. Remember how you remained faithful even though it meant terrible suffering. You accepted it with joy. You knew there were better things waiting for you that will last forever. So do not throw away this confident trust in the Lord. Remember the great reward it brings you. Patient endurance is what you need now so that you will continue to do God's will. Then you will receive all that he has promised. For in just a little while the coming one will come and not delay, and my righteous ones will live by faith, but I will take no pleasure in anyone who turns away. But we are not like those who turn away from God to their own destruction. We are the faithful ones whose souls will be saved.